This spring, history is coming to life right in the heart of Charleston. Today's conversation is with Dr. Sarah Platt, a leading expert in historical archaeology and material culture, who's overseeing an archaeological excavation at the Heyward-Washington House, one of the city's most historically layered sites. The property at 87 Church Street, now known as the Heyward-Washington House, was originally part of a 1694 land grant identified as half of Lot 72 in Charleston's early city plan. The first known residents appear in 1737 when a gunsmith named John Milner Sr. started operating a workshop on the site. As the public armorer for the colonial government, Milner was responsible for maintaining government firearms and relied heavily on the expertise of several enslaved artisans, including a carpenter, blacksmith, and gunsmith. He was also paid to repair weapons for Native American delegations visiting the city. When Milner Sr. died in 1749, his will named 10 enslaved individuals and passed them, along with the property, to his wife and children. His son, John Milner Jr., inherited the Church Street lot and continued the gunsmith business for a short time, but lost government contracts due to poor performance and eventually lost the property after falling into debt and legal trouble. The site was purchased in 1768 by Daniel Heyward, a wealthy plantation owner, who passed it on to his son, Thomas Heyward Jr., a signer of the Declaration of Independence. The Heywards demolished the original structures and built the townhouse, kitchen, stable, and privy that still stand today. During this time, Thomas Heyward and his family, along with enslaved individuals, lived at the property, and in 1791 it famously hosted President George Washington during his southern tour. Over the years, the property also served as a girls' school, a boarding house, tenement, and even a bakery before becoming a historic house museum operated by the Charleston Museum in 1929. But this new excavation, which is a partnership between the Charleston Museum and the College of Charleston, is focused on what came before all of that, on the very first occupation of the site by the Milner family and the enslaved individuals whose labor supported a thriving gunsmithing operation. Dr. Platt and her students are turning their attention to the garden area where they hope to uncover physical traces of this early 18th century workshop and gain insights into Charleston's role in arming the colony. All right, we got that in under 3 minutes. Thanks for bearing with me. Bigger thanks to Dr. Platt for providing all of that background information so that you have a bit of context coming into this conversation to understand just how powerful it is. And I hope that you just enjoy hearing about how history can help us to recover the stories buried in our cities and our past. Welcome to Grandma's Silver, where tradition meets today. I'm Allie, your host of the Grandma Silver podcast and founder of the Grand Millennial Lifestyle. Here, we blend aesthetics with nostalgia, engaging in conversations with lifestyle brands, designers, and more to rediscover the timeless charm of the past. Join me as we journey from home to heart, illuminating the past and polishing the present with the gleam of Grandma Silver. I'm really excited to have Dr. Sarah Platt here today. Could you give folks, before we really dive into this further, a little bit of background on you? Tell us a little bit of your journey and then how you got involved with this project in particular.
Absolutely. So I have my PhD in anthropology from Syracuse University, and I got it in 2022. As you kind of know, in the United States, archaeology falls under the umbrella of anthropology. There's a history of archaeology's development as a discipline as to why, but most of the archaeologists that you see that specialize in North American archaeology, their PhD will be in anthropology. So I have my PhD in anthropology. I specialize in historical archaeology, and that is because of my earliest exposures to archaeology was in Southern Maryland at St. Mary's College of Maryland, where I did my undergrad, which is closely associated with St. Mary's City, which is kind of Maryland's Jamestown. So I was working on historical archaeology sites from a very kind of young age, and it kind of sent me on this journey. I've always had a strong connection to the Charleston, South Carolina area. My parents were in the Navy here. They were stationed here when there was still a Navy base, and they loved it here. So throughout my childhood, I was being brought to Charleston to kind of experience the area. We were here on vacation, and as I went into my kind of undergrad, I had a professor, Dr. Julie King, who knew that I really loved this area and I loved the Low Country and I loved this history. She said, well, there's archaeology in Charleston. That is something that you can kind of put these passions together if that is something you're interested in. And she introduced me to Martha Zierden, who was the curator of archaeology at the Charleston Museum at the time. Martha very graciously took me as a young undergrad into her lab and showed me around and sent me home with a stack of site reports to read. Then we did not speak again until I was in graduate school when I was looking for a dissertation project. I had a colleague who reconnected me with Martha at a conference. And at that point, I was a grad student. I was much older. I had my BA. Martha said, we have oodles and oodles of collections, urban collections here at the Charleston Museum. Please come do a project with us for your dissertation. I got some grant money and I went down and I worked with the Charleston Museum for 2 years, focusing on the Heyward-Washington House. The Heyward-Washington House is very well known for kind of its standing buildings and outbuildings, but it's also one of the most archaeologically investigated properties on the Charleston Peninsula. They first started excavating kind of in the 1970s, and they've been going back sort of ever since. So it's one of the largest collections that the Charleston Museum holds, and it has some of the most spectacular objects that have been kind of excavated on the Charleston Peninsula. But because of the nature of the early archaeology, the work that was done by Dr. Elaine Harold, our understanding of the archaeology was fairly limited. It was basically limited to the work that Martha Zierden had done in the early 2000s. So my job as a young PhD student was to start to go back to that old archaeology, to those old artifacts, and try to make sense of them. And in the process, I became very, very interested kind of in the early sort of colonial period on this site that's associated with the gunsmith, and even earlier occupation that might date back to the 17th century, which I'm sure we'll talk more about. So revisited those collections, and in that process, we did identify some knowledge gaps. So now, as a faculty member at the College of Charleston, being able to return to Charleston after kind of a hiatus up at Monticello in Charlottesville, Virginia, I have that capacity to kind of return and answer some of these sort of ongoing research questions that we have, and take students along for the ride.
This is slightly off topic, but I
absolutely.
loved hearing that you said you said Maryland?
Yeah.
Historical archaeology, I'm from the Philadelphia suburbs.
Okay. Yeah.
So do you find that that's more an East Coast thing?
It definitely started on the East Coast. The history of historical archaeology it kind of dates back to the 1950s. It started off as historic sites archaeology. And I should say this is the tradition of historical archaeology here in the United States. Australia, and if you look at Australia's history, it starts to make a little bit more sense. Australia also had a tradition of historical archaeology that kind of developed independently. But here in the United States, it started off as kind of quote unquote historic sites archaeology, which is a slight difference, right? It's looking at sites of quote unquote historical significance and doing archaeology at those sites. So if you look at some of the early centers of historical archaeology and historical archaeology training, it's Jamestown, it's colonial Williamsburg, right? And these sort of significant historic sites, especially in kind of the Virginia, Maryland area. And then it starts to expand and evolve as kind of our definition of historical archaeology broadens to not just sites of historical significance, but to sites associated with the modern world. So sites of the last sort of 500 years or so. Archaeology of kind of lifeways and experiences that are starting to look more like the world that we live in currently.
Interesting. I didn't really think about that, but I was like, oh yeah, historical archaeology. I don't hear people reference archaeology as historical archaeology as a specialty, rarely outside of the East Coast. So that was just something I was thinking about. You also mentioned that the Heyward-Washington House is, I think, one of the most excavated and points of interest on the Charleston Peninsula. Is there a particular reason for that? Because of course, Charleston has so much history. So what is it about the Heyward-Washington House that's both so historically interesting, but also that makes the artifacts that come from it so telling?
So I will back up just a little bit, just to kind of correct what I said earlier in terms of historical archaeology. I would say the modern discipline is international, which
Okay.
is really, really neat. So it's not just East Coast US, but we see people of a variety of different backgrounds kind of doing this kind of work, which is what makes it such a vibrant sort of field of study. But in terms of the Heyward-Washington House, what is really special about this property is that it was one of the first sort of lots and homes that was preserved as part of the early historic preservation movement here in Charleston. So it was purchased by the museum in 1929. It's one of these first sort of house museums in downtown Charleston. What that means is that it's been kind of kept safe for over 100 years or close to 100 years. No one's putting a pool in the backyard, right? It hasn't been kind of a target of any sort of significant development that would disrupt those soil layers and artifacts that we're really interested in as archaeologists. It's been preserved from folks who also are very interested sort of in the artifacts and the history of Charleston, but are not necessarily trained archaeologists. And they go in and they're really interested in digging privies to get sort of whole objects and bottles that they then kind of collect. Because of the history of this property as a house museum, it's been kept safe for 100 years and all the archaeology has been kept in place, which means it's relatively untouched. So everything is, for the most part, preserved in place and leaving it for us to find. It's also an interesting property in terms of where it is located. So it's on Church Street, just south of Broad Street, but it's contained within the boundaries of the original city wall. So Charleston was founded to be kind of a modern sort of planned city. It had a very specific sort of city plan inspired by Enlightenment era ideals. You have kind of your regular sort of gridded streets, right? Inspired by kind of the Lord's proprietors' ideas of kind of improvement and modern city planning. When folks actually started establishing the city, they encountered the realities of this colonial landscape. And in particular, they were very fearful of the Spanish, who were kind of just south of us towards Port Royal and in Florida. So they built a city wall, and that wall enclosed roughly from about kind of Water Street up north to Market Street and as far kind of inland as Meeting Street. Heyward-Washington, the property, 87 Church Street, is situated directly in the middle of that old city wall. So it's not just capturing 100 years, 200 years of history. We're capturing the whole span of life on the Charleston Peninsula and a diversity of life. The site's mostly interpreted right now as being kind of the domestic household of the Heyward family and the experiences of the people that the Heyward family enslaved on this site. But this property was not just an elite dwelling, it was also a gunsmith shop. It was also a girls' school briefly. It was also a boarding house and a tenement. And then it was also a bakery. The Heywards really didn't live there for that long, right? It was mostly these diverse experiences of a variety of different walks of life who are kind of passing through this property. Kind of in summary, it's been protected for a long time. The archaeology is there for us to find. And then it's just this amazing cross-section of kind of Charleston urban dwellers through the last few centuries.
That's really exciting. And I can't wait to dive into this more. I do need to back up for 1 second. And this is such a small detail, but you mentioned privies.
Yeah.
The layperson may not know that term. So could you outline just what that means for a second in case anyone's scratching their head?
Absolutely, absolutely. It's ye olde porta-john. It is a bathroom before we had indoor plumbing. And some folks may remember this from when they were growing up, but you would have to essentially dig a really deep hole and put a building over top of it. On archaeology sites, we love privies. There's a variety of reasons for that. You can get all sorts of data out of privies, but especially since they were a convenient low place to dispose of things, you tend to find a lot of stuff in privies. And once a privy is done, there's also, it seems to be a practice of kind of filling it in with whatever sort of garbage you might have to kind of seal it and sort of keep all the nasty stuff within the privy. But that means we find tons of old pottery, tons of bottles, all sorts of whole objects that we don't often encounter on archaeology sites. We find them in privies. So really, really cool archaeological feature.
Yeah. Going back, obviously, to the Heyward-Washington House and this particular excavation, could you talk a little bit about because I know that there have obviously, as you even mentioned, this is not a kickoff experience, right? There's been a history of archaeology on the property. So what are you excavating this season? Also, what are you hoping, what are you hoping to learn from the site that you're excavating?
Absolutely. Kind of as I noted, there's 50 years of work that has happened at this site. So it's not just me, it's also Martha Zierden, former curator at the Charleston Museum, and then again, her predecessor, Dr. Elaine Harold. Martha's successor, John Fisher, is kind of leading the charge. Oodles and oodles of archaeology has occurred at this property, but it's all been in kind of one half of the lot. The front half kind of around the house and around the kitchen building and sort of in the work yards, which is awesome. And we found there's lots to be found kind of in that part of the property, and we have learned a lot. But as I kind of hinted at before, most of that work in terms of volume was done by Dr. Elaine Harold in the 1970s. And she was a good archaeologist, and she's credited with bringing urban archaeology to the city. But she left Charleston sort of in the 1980s. And she had always intended to finish her work at the Heyward-Washington House. She did about 5 years of volunteer work, just excavating the majority of this site. She'd always intended to finish, but unfortunately was never able to, became ill in kind of the last 2 decades, and then passed away without ever finishing her work. And unfortunately, it seems like a lot of the paperwork that's actually associated with the archaeological excavation, which is as important as, if not more important than the artifacts themselves, and we can talk about why that is, this paperwork was likely lost as part of her estate. So we have all of her stuff. We have some maps where we can kind of place stuff in the landscape and how deep it is under the ground, but not everything that we need. So we have this very, very cool archaeology, but we don't really understand it in context. And we need to be able to see not just where the artifacts are coming from sort of in space, but we need to understand how deep in the ground these artifacts are coming from. So with the loss of that paperwork, our understanding of the actual stratigraphy of this site, so the soil layering that gives us a lot of information, is incomplete. So one of our goals with going back is to find stuff associated in particular with this early gunsmith shop that predates the standing landscape, kind of in place, in situ, to kind of do better science with it. The second sort of research outcome and goal is to investigate this sort of rear garden where we are working. So again, most of the archaeology has kind of occurred on the front half of the lot. Very, very little has occurred on the back. So there's kind of just a blank space in our knowledge on that front. But we do have specific sort of research questions that are associated with that part of the property. Our primary interest is in this workshop that was on the site before any of the buildings that you see standing there currently. This gunsmith workshop was first on site around the 1730s, and it was being run by this guy, John Milner Sr., who served as the public armorer for the colony. So he was repairing the militia firearms for the colonial government, and he was also being paid by the government to repair the firearms of visiting indigenous delegations. So Native American communities that were coming to Charleston for political reasons or for kind of trade and economic reasons. So he ran this gunsmith shop on the site until a fire in 1740. This is a massive fire that's well documented that destroyed a significant component of what is now downtown Charleston, including this site. We have documentary evidence of John Milner and likely the people he enslaved having to relocate these government firearms as he was watching his property burn. So total loss of this gunsmith workshop. It seems that for about 10 years, this gunsmith workshop is abandoned, but John Milner is continuing to work. So we suspect that he had moved his operations towards the back half of the property because he owned not just the lot that Heyward-Washington is currently situated on, but also the one behind it. So generally with archaeology, we don't just go because we have a gap in our knowledge. We don't want to disturb a site unless we have some sort of need to. So our question is in part to try to understand that sequence of events, to see if he has additional sort of gunsmithing infrastructure in the back half of the property. Those are kind of our major sort of driving reasons for being back there, in addition to training students.
I want to hear more in a minute about, you mentioned the paperwork, and
Yeah.
I think that would be important for additional context. However, I do also, another buzzword that came up was stratigraphy, which you did kind of touch on what that is, but could you explain again, just for folks who may not be putting two and two together, why the soil levels and layers are significant?
Absolutely. And that actually leads well into that sort of paperwork discussion. So in archaeology, a lot of people have this conception that it's almost like treasure hunting, that you're just going out and you're just
Indiana
pulling.
Jonesing it.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. Just like snagging things from temples, right? With little concern for the temple itself. That's not what true archaeology as a science, how it functions. So in archaeology, we're interested in the artifacts, but what we're actually way more interested in is this concept of context. So where the artifact is found and what it is found with, because the context is what allows us to tell stories about the site that we are working on and to form kind of research narratives about the site that we're interested in. So when I'm teaching context to my students, I always talk about an instance when I worked out at McLeod Plantation as an interpreter on James Island. This was a plantation site that had kind of a main house and a series of slave cabins kind of along a road entryway. The key thing about McLeod is their interpretive focus is always about the enslaved people on this site. All that said, at McLeod, when I talk to visitors, I would bring up this incident where we found a little Lego piece that was in front of one of these cabins. And I would show them this Lego piece and I'd say, okay, what can you tell me about this Lego piece? And they'd say like, oh, it's a toy, maybe it looks like Batman, what have you, right? And then I tell the visitors, okay, we found this Lego piece in front of this cabin. What do we know now? And the story completely changes, right? We can start talking about kind of the individuals who are living in this cabin, the kids who are living in this cabin. This is how we connect artifacts to people and artifacts to place. So context in many ways is way more important than the artifacts itself. So we want to know where these objects are found. And not only do we want to know spatially where objects are found, so where on the site or where on the planet these objects were found, we also want to know how deep in the ground they are found. And that is because of something called stratigraphy, which is kind of the buildup of soil layers through time, whether through human activity or geological activity or what have you. These soil layers, they not only allow us to understand human activity, they also help us tell time. And that is because of certain geological principles. Deeper layers are older, while layers closer to the top and closer to the ground we're standing on are younger. By looking at stratigraphy and looking at context, we can again start to tell more accurate stories about the site we are working on, rather than just talking about the object itself. We could talk about artifacts with people. That is why paperwork is so, so important in archaeology. And if you come and visit us out at the Heyward-Washington House as you're working, you'll see most of us, a good 30% of the time, we're sitting there and we're filling out field forms or we're writing in our field journals and we're documenting every single thing we do. It's because of that context thing. We're trying to maintain context. We're trying to understand where this stuff is coming from, in part because in order to dig the site, we have to destroy the stratigraphy as we do it. It's a destructive science. So once we dig the site, that site is gone. We can't get that back. So we need to record it very, very carefully as we go. And that is why it is such a tragedy that much of Elaine Harold's paperwork was ultimately lost. We can do quite a lot with what's left, but ideally we would still have those maps.
Absolutely. And I think, again, I was going to touch on folks visiting later in the conversation, but I would certainly implore them to take a peek into the pit, which is really like ultimately the square that each archaeologist is digging in, right? Sometimes two, depending on the size, but it is really fascinating to see the literal change in levels of the soil. That's a whole separate conversation and just so interesting, and how archaeology works. You know, you have to look for soil change and like color change, and
Right.
but once the pit gets low enough, you can literally see layers in the soil along the side, which is really fun.
It is super cool. And that fire that I mentioned that's driving much of our research questions at that site, we can see it. Like
I was
if we,
about to ask, you can see the ash. Are you seeing
yes,
the elements?
absolutely. So especially in based on kind of the previous work of Martha Zier and Elaine Harold, and in their soil profiles, which is a fancy word for a map of what those soil layers look like, they see this ash layer, this destruction layer in this soil stratigraphy. And they've also found, Elaine Harold has found kind of the burned remains of the original house that was on the property. So careful sort of stratigraphic, context-driven excavation can highlight where these moments sort of occur kind of in the ground right beneath our feet.
Now, how long? So at the time, it's April 1st today, which is when we're recording. This will go out in the next 2 weeks. So you have been at this point for how long?
We started right after spring break for my students, so kind of mid-March, and we've been out there Fridays and Saturdays. And that is sort of an untraditional form for a field school. And we can talk about why we're taking this approach. But we've been there since early March, and we should be there through April 19th.
Okay. I don't know how much you're allowed to share, but could you speak to any of the things that you have found or even what you might be hoping to find?
So what we're hoping to find, again, is evidence of this early gunsmith workshop in place. The thing about urban sites in archaeology is that there's just tons and tons of human activity in cities. And that means that lots of garbage, lots of dirt moving. And essentially what that means for us, trying to get back to kind of the 1740s or thereabouts, we have to go pretty deep at this site. So we are still temporally, in terms of our soil layers, kind of up in the 20th century as we are trying to kind of get through all of these irrigation infrastructure lines that they've put in for the garden, have what looks like to be a 20th century sort of bottle dump in the rear part of the garden. And we're kind of working through that right now, which is actually giving our students a great opportunity to learn the field methods, so the tools and the actual approaches to digging before we get to the stuff we're really, really looking for.
A good practice.
Exactly, exactly. It's like, okay, we're finding a Pond's jar. You guys are fine. Like, just keep going. We are encountering, and this is part of the research process, we are encountering a whole lot more 20th century material than I think we were anticipating. 20th century and sort of late 19th century, so late 1800s, early 1900s. But we're hoping on the back half of this dig that we're going to get down kind of the last foot that we need to be, and that we're going to start encountering features from the Milner era on the property.
So again, for those who might be unfamiliar with sort of the material culture, which is really, if we boil that down, you know, kind of like the artifacts that you're finding, right?
Mm-hmm.
What sorts of things could support evidence of the gunsmith shop?
What's really nifty, and if you think about material culture, it's the things that kind of form our world around us. And even in the objects that exist kind of in our own world, those things tend to change through time as styles change and as technologies change. So there are certain objects that we know, much like you have your iPhone 14, your iPhone 16, et cetera, there are certain objects that we know are associated with certain time frames that were being used as in certain periods. When we're working on a site like the Heyward-Washington House, one of those best objects for telling time on that site is ceramics, so pottery. Broken pottery survives really, really well in the ground. It doesn't degrade, doesn't break down. As styles and tastes change and as technologies improve, ceramics also change in a way that we can see. For us as archaeologists, we're really looking at these ceramics and looking for certain types of ceramics that occur kind of during this mid 1700s sort of time frame. There's certain types that people are using a lot of that if we see those, we know we're in the right time frame. Once we get to the gunsmith workshop, we are especially looking for things that are associated with blacksmithing. Another archaeologist has said with gunsmithing, you're really looking at a blacksmithing site with guns on it, right? Because it's a lot of the same sort of production processes. So we're looking for tools of the trade. So we're looking for things like files and pliers, the sort of things that they would be using to actually do the work. We are also looking for the gun parts, obviously, but also scrap metal and things like iron that would have been used to actually produce these objects. On this site too, we tend to find a lot of what's called slag, which are these like kind of crumbly, sort of bubbly looking material that is associated with iron production. And it's all of the kind of impurities that sort of bubble up whenever you're working with iron. We'll find that in kind of great numbers on a site like this one. So we're looking for all of those things. But for right now, with where we're at, we're just looking for those 18th century ceramics that can tell us we're in the right time frame.
This is so interesting, and my mind is swirling because there's a million other questions, right? But one of the things that I think maybe listeners might not understand or know the process of is that, you've touched on some of these other layers and artifacts that come out of that, despite the fact that those artifacts are not what you are setting out to find. They are still artifacts. They still get bagged. They still get labeled, all the things. So could you talk a little bit about if that at all plays into what you're trying to figure out in this particular excavation, but then also what is happening with those artifacts? Because there is such a storied history to the property. If I'm not mistaken, there was a lot of, in previous you might have even been involved. There's a lot of African American history.
Mm-hmm.
So the artifacts still contribute to a larger story.
Mm-hmm.
They just don't contribute to this particular research project, if you will. So could you
Absolutely.
talk a little bit about what happens with everything that you are finding?
For sure. So, and I will say, if we were being hyper-focused just on our research questions, all those 20th century layers that we're still currently working on, we would just blast through those. You wouldn't even look at those, right? But that's not how archaeology works. All of this history is still valuable for understanding the story of this property. So we are treating these kind of 20th century layers much the same way we would those early 1700 layers that we're really looking for. And to your point, because it captures this wide span of history that occurred on this property. For these layers that are near the top with all these bottles and kind of late 1800s, early 1900s material, it's telling us quite a bit about the Fusler era of the property, which is when it was a bakery.
Okay.
And then also potentially about when it was a tenement and boarding house where a lot of these residents were probably Black Charlestonians, right? So it's just a different part of the history. And we still are making sure that we're treating that with the same level of care that we are treating these earlier layers. It's also important to emphasize that even with this gunsmithing workshop, most of this labor was being done by enslaved artisans that we do in fact know the name of. So when we're talking about this history, Black Charleston's history extends throughout this sort of cross-section of Charleston life.
Okay.
In terms of talking about the artifacts themselves, so once we gather these artifacts, again, they're very carefully gathered by that context that we were talking about earlier. Everything from one soil layer kind of gets bagged up together. And all that important information about where it was found is written on the bag. And then that bag goes to our lab at the College of Charleston, where students are currently working on washing all of these artifacts to get all the dirt off so that we can tell what it is and start to see if we're seeing kind of those early 1700s artifacts that we're interested in. Once it's washed and dried, they will be very carefully bagged in archival sort of plastic bags, and then they'll go to the museum for further analysis. And it's in that analysis sort of process that we're going to start figuring out that time thing. We're going to look at the artifacts to make sure the soil layers are where we expect them to be. After that, the artifacts will go into long-term storage to serve as a resource for future researchers. So again, that's how I got my start. I was doing archaeology on archaeology that had happened many, many years prior. And because those artifacts were cared for and kept on the shelves, I was able to go back and ask new questions. That's kind of the long-term plan for these objects.
Neat. Well, I want to make sure that I touch on something that you brought up a little while ago, which was that you are bringing your students out a couple of days a week.
Yeah.
People don't maybe realize traditional field schools don't always operate that way, almost never, in fact. They're usually very expensive. They require travel. You have to go for several weeks, perhaps several months. Sometimes you can get credit for them. Sometimes you don't. But, you know, in archaeology, of course, that hands-on experience is so important that as a student, this seems like such a valuable resource for them. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. Field schools, again, are this practical sort of course that allows students to actually dig a site. And this is really, really necessary for all of the reasons that we've been discussing in terms of maintaining context and things like that. I can talk about that and soil layers in a classroom until the cows come home, but until a student actually experiences that out in the field, they're not going to be able to do it, right? So these field schools are really, really critical for a variety of different reasons, but especially for our students, they are necessary in order to continue in the field and actually get a job in this field. And there's a whole other kind of bevy of reasons why field schools are valuable. They get students kind of out of their normal contexts, right? They're doing sort of manual labor out in the sun, kind of off campus. And it teaches students certain life skills, like things like resiliency, right?
Digging it's not for the weak. I will say that.
No, it's not. And
tough. It's hard.
It is, but teaching students how to kind of operate in that sort of setting is so immensely valuable. So not just like field schools in archaeology, but field schools in whatever discipline I highly endorse a student just experiencing. Regardless, as you noted, these field schools traditionally occur during the summer. They're often kind of a month to many months long. They can be abroad, so you have to fly to whatever sort of exotic location in order to kind of get this experience. And even if it's local, if it's during the summer, you don't necessarily have your dorm housing, so you're having to find housing. You're having to pay additional dollars in summer tuition. You might not be able to apply your scholarships or financial aid to the process. We're joining a whole new bevy of higher ed institutions that are trying this in-semester model with a field school. We're working at a site that's walking distance from campus. We're only working kind of a set number of days per week, which will allow students to live in their current housing and to continue to work if they need to, and take their other classes alongside this one while gating these sort of practical field method experiences. And it also has the benefit of opening the door for students to sort of apply their financial aid to this process. So our hope, not just at this institution, but all institutions that are attempting this model, is that this will broaden the scope of who can participate in these field schools. Because if your field school is 6 weeks in a exotic location, only a certain kind of students can be able to participate in that. And one of my first field schools was in West Africa, and I wouldn't trade that experience for the world, but it's just not practical for many folks, including students who work, but also students who have families and might be coming back to their education later in life. We're doing this program in semester to sort of test the model and to see if it works for us, and hopefully we'll be able to carry it forward for future students.
I also think it's really exciting. I guess where I'm going with this is to interact with the material culture that you ultimately want to be studying. I think also is a really helpful training tool.
Absolutely. And you're kind of preaching to the choir, because I'm someone who started in historical archaeology and wanted to continue to do it because I was really interested in this history that was sort of right at our doorstep. To your point, too, one of the largest employers of archaeologists in this country are cultural resource management firms, which are private sort of archaeology firms that take contracts to do archaeology in compliance with local, state, and federal legislation. So, for example, if you are building a highway with federal money, you need to do archaeology first. And that's part of kind of a body of legislation that's in place to protect our cultural heritage and make sure it's still there for future generations going forward. Most of that archaeology that you're going to be doing ahead of the highway is going to be indigenous archaeology, or it's going to be kind of historic period archaeology. Exposing students to local archaeology is really, really important, because if they continue in the field, the vast majority of them, the kind of archaeology that they're going to do, just statistically in terms of the major employers of archaeologists, is going to be kind of historical and prehistoric archaeology. Granted, like, you can learn these methods just about anywhere, and I'm a huge fan if you have the resources to do so and you want to go far afield for a summer to kind of experience the world and do archaeology elsewhere, I highly encourage you to do so. Because again, I wouldn't trade that kind of experience for the world. But these kinds of local opportunities, these local training opportunities for producing local archaeologists are really, really important.
On that same note, I find it really interesting that you're inviting the public out to watch this in real time.
I come from a long tradition of wanting to do sort of public facing work and educating the wider public on what archaeology is, that it's not treasure hunting, that it is a science, and that we use it as a tool to not only understand the past in an accurate way, but also to quite literally expose histories that might have been deliberately sort of hidden over the past few decades, right? It's such an important tool for that. So allowing these opportunities for the public to kind of see what we do as archaeologists and to see kind of history being sort of uncovered in process is really, really important. But even more important is getting our students to talk to the public, right? And learn how to describe what we're doing in a really accessible way, in a way that someone who's never taken an anthropology class can kind of understand what we were doing and understand why it's really, really cool. Science communication and heritage communication is one of the most important things that we can sort of do in this field. And building these opportunities in for students to do that work is especially important.
On that same kind of note, is there anything that you're hopeful that, I mean, you kind of touched on it already, but is there anything that you're hopeful visitors take away about preservation? I know you kind of touched on archaeology, but just the importance of preserving and telling these stories through the research. And maybe that's too close of a question to what you just kind of answered, but
no, it's a great question. So one of the most important things I always like to point out to not just visitors, but especially locals who are coming through the site, is that we actually do not have a protective ordinance in place for archaeological resources in the city of Charleston, unlike many cities of kind of similar historical import. They've been trying to get an ordinance in place since the 1970s. And again, we have one of the most stringent protective ordinances for above ground resources. So all the buildings and the wonderful buildings you see, right? Since the 1930s, we've been protecting above ground resources. And it's what makes Charleston such a wonderful place to visit, is all these buildings being preserved and this landscape being preserved. We just have not managed to get an ordinance in place. And folks long before me have been fighting to get one of these laws in place, similar to Alexandria in Virginia, that has a wonderful municipal archaeology program. We got really close before COVID in 2019, but it ultimately failed, and then COVID happened, and so it was kind of dead in the water. These resources that we're uncovering at the Heyward-Washington House are coming up left and right in downtown Charleston. We're not particularly worried about kind of private property owners necessarily, but there's a lot of these huge development projects that are happening that don't have any sort of legal mechanisms in place to kind of slow down the work and do the archaeology first. If you have a large sort of federal project, there are laws in place that mean that you have to do archaeology first. But for a lot of these big sort of apartment developments and hotel developments, it's all private money. So there's nothing to kind of encourage them to do the archaeology first. Because archaeology, as we talked about, is a destructive science. Once it's dug up, it's gone, and all that capacity to do science with it, it's just absent. And again, if you're not looking at these artifacts in context, it's just very limited what you can ultimately do with that to actually tell these stories in an accurate way. Once it's gone, it's gone. And so resources are being destroyed on the Charleston Peninsula, sort of left and right. So I always try to say to the public, like, we don't have an ordinance in place. It would be good to have one, right, in order to protect these resources or to at least know where these resources are and to have that kind of knowledge in place with city government. And the other thing that I always try to impart on guests, especially when we're at the Heyward-Washington House, is the wide range of histories that occur on these properties. By necessity, we often preserve these homes in kind of a certain point in time, but just the 87 Church Street and the Heyward-Washington House, just the scope of the experiences that occurred just on this one sort of town lot. It wasn't just the Heywards. It wasn't just George Washington who was there for 8 days, right? Mm-hmm. It was all these other families. Some of them we don't have names for, who passed through that place and come from a wide of variety of cultural backgrounds and class backgrounds. Archaeology allows us to see that sort of wide range of experiences. That then allows the museum to kind of incorporate that information into their interpretation and share it with future visitors.
I'm obviously an advocate.
Yeah.
But we'll hopefully continue to spread the word, right? I think, right. Yeah, that is so important. And I hope that people take the time to look into why and think about why. One of the last things I was going to ask you is just kind of a fun question. And sometimes it's like dig to dig. Do you have anything that has just stuck with you that you have found?
That's one of the most common questions I get is what artifact you found that was super cool. And I have those sorts of answers, but I think how I've started to answer that question is often it's in the collective. It's all the stuff kind of taken together and then the stories that it can tell from there that I find really, really interesting. And especially at this site, the stories that have emerged about the people that were enslaved by the Milners, where again, we know them by name, just to see their stories sort of come out of the data has been especially important and especially gratifying.
Well, to literally come out of the dirt, I mean, how chilling that can be.
Just again, how important that is, right? In terms of kind of countering these old narratives that we have about our past. And when we can literally see the evidence sort of kind of come out of the ground and come out of the archive, it's in those moments that this work is especially sort of gratifying and important, I think.
Well, thank you for sharing. I will just throw it out here for those listening that we will make sure to have all the different links to kind of all the different things we've talked about today. So, of course, the Heyward-Washington House, the Charleston Museum, to the program for folks who are interested in potentially looking into that a little bit. Is there a link for the dig or information on the dig out there?
There is, and I will, the museum has one. I will send that along.
Wonderful. Well, I'll make sure to share all of that in our show notes. So it's like a one-stop shop for everybody that's listening. Otherwise, I just thank you so much for letting me nerd out with you today. And this has been a really fun conversation, also really enlightening. And I hope that people continue to follow along and just see what comes out of this, quite literally.
Yeah, for sure.